There is a version of you that surfaces when no one important is watching. Not just no audience, no phone, no mirror, no internal narrator running the quiet background audit of how you're doing. Something that doesn't remember to check its own face. Something that laughs without calculating whether the laugh lands right. You've probably felt it disappear the moment a door opens. What I'm going to show you today is not about introversion. It isn't social anxiety, performance anxiety, or anything else that points cleanly at a diagnosis. It's something older, something that formed before you had language for it, and something most people never examine because the part of you that would do the examining is itself the thing I'm describing. By the end of this, the question won't be who you are around other people. The question will be whether there's anyone there when you aren't. Start from the outside because someone watching you from across the room can sometimes name it before you can. There are people who are never quite at rest. Not physically, they might be composed, fluent, precise, but something in them is always tuning. You talk to them and you sense calibration running, reading you, adjusting, returning something constructed for what you seem to need. It isn't manipulation. It's accommodation so deep it has become reflex, and the person running it has no idea it's running. Carl Jung named the outer layer of identity in the early 20th century. He called it the persona, from the Latin for the mask worn in ancient theater, and he was careful not to treat it as a lie. The persona is functional. It is the interface between the individual and the world, the version that navigates professional rooms, adjusts its register for unfamiliar company, remembers which parts of itself are welcome where. The problem Jung identified wasn't the mask. It was what happened when the mask and the face behind it fused, when a person had worn the adaptation so continuously that they could no longer locate the seam. That's what I want you to look at. Not in someone else. In the specific, private moment when you are alone and quiet, and the performance hasn't stopped. To understand how that happens, you have to go back further than Jung. Back to a pediatrician and psychoanalyst working in London in the 1950s, a man named Donald Winnicott, who drew a distinction so precise it took decades to fully land. Winnicott watched infants. Specifically, he watched what happened when a caretaker could meet the child's impulses with presence, when the child reached, and something reached back. When a feeling was expressed and the environment returned something that acknowledged it. In those conditions, the child developed what he called the true self, a practical thing, not a philosophical one, the capacity to feel real, to act from spontaneous impulse, to exist without first calculating whether existence will be received. But when the caretaker had needs that took precedence, when the child's feelings were too intense or wrong in a way that produced withdrawal or simply met with absence, the child learned to check before expressing, to feel first, then edit, to become, in Winnicott's language, compliant. A child is dependent and it knows it. The structure that reads the room and adjusts for safety is doing exactly what it was built to do. Winnicott called this structure the false self, and he was precise. It isn't a lie. It's a caretaker. Something built to manage the environment so that something more fragile, deeper in, could be kept from harm. The problem is the timing. The adaptation was built for a room that no longer exists. The threat that made compliance necessary is decades gone, but the structure is still running, still calibrating on a world that moved on long ago. And the person inside it can't locate the off switch, because the person inside it isn't sure where the structure ends and they begin. Here's what the literature tends to understate. The false self doesn't run for other people. That's the misunderstanding. You would expect, if this were purely a social mechanism, that it would shut off in private, that behind a closed door, with no one watching, you would simply be. But you've noticed that isn't what happens. The narration continues. The audit runs. Something is still watching, still adjusting, still monitoring the performance in the room with no one else in it. A psychiatrist named Bradshaw spent decades drawing a distinction that matters here. Guilt is relational. It points at a specific thing you did, and in theory it can be repaired. The debt has a location. Shame is different. Shame doesn't point at the action, it points at the person. Something you're wrong, not something you did wrong. And unlike guilt, it has no repair mechanism. There is nothing specific to fix because the wrongness is at the level of the self. A child who learns that their spontaneous self, their actual impulses, their unedited feelings, reliably produces withdrawal or silence or disapproval, doesn't walk away with guilt. They walk away with shame. The lesson isn't you did something wrong. The lesson is you are something wrong. And the false self is built on top of that lesson like a structure on a fault line, a management system designed to keep the thing underneath from ever being exposed. This is why the performance continues when no one is watching, because the audience it was built for was never external. It is the internal witness, the part that has been running the audit since long before you could name it, checking whether this impulse is acceptable, whether you are taking up the right amount of space, whether the feeling you just had, the uncalibrated one, would survive contact with a room that may not have existed for 30 years. The show isn't for them, it's for you. It runs on shame the way a pilot light runs, quietly without being asked. I want to ask you something specific, and I want you to answer before you reach for the comfortable version. Think of a decision you made recently, a real one, not logistics, not what to eat, but one with weight. And when you ran the scenarios, when you felt the pull in one direction and the resistance in another, whose voice were you inside? The standard you were checking against, the approval you were sensing for or sensing against, does it belong to someone alive, someone who knows you now, or does it belong to a room you lived in much earlier, one whose occupants may not have been aware of what they were asking of you? The psychologist Mary Ainsworth, working in the 1960s, found that the patterns of safety a child learns with their earliest caretakers become the templates through which they read every subsequent relationship. The nervous system doesn't update the template just because the circumstances change. It keeps running the original map on new terrain, checking for the same signals, watching for the same threats, in rooms where those threats no longer apply. Your internal audience is running on that map. The performance you give in private is calibrated for a reader who may be decades old, and the impulses you edit out, the ones that feel, even alone, like too much, they're being screened by someone who never knew your adult life. Here's what I'll leave you with, and I'm not going to answer it. Imagine you found out, without ambiguity, that the original condition no longer applied, that the thing the false self was built to protect you from, the withdrawal, the silence that meant you had been too much, was no longer a threat, gone. In fact, not in metaphor. What would you do differently? What would you stop editing? What version of yourself would you stop keeping back from the room you're sitting in right now? Because if the answer is anything other than nothing, if there's something you have been managing, even from yourself, even in the quiet, then the question isn't whether you have a false self. The question is what it has been protecting all this time, and whether that thing is still in there, waiting for a room safe enough to exist in, or whether after enough years of management you stopped being able to find it, and the character became so complete that you forgot there was ever a person underneath. Take 30 seconds tonight alone with nothing to do and no one to become. See what moves first. Then decide which one of you came here to understand the psychology, and which one came to find out if it still knows its own name.